The week in the mountains was supposed to be one of those family trips that we'd look back on for years. It was late June, and my wife, Emily, and I decided to take our 3 kids, Jake, 12, Lily, 9, and Sam, 6, camping in the Adirondacks. We'd been planning the trip for months. The kids were excited about hiking, seeing wildlife, and spending nights under the stars. It was a way to unplug, bond, and create memories. We booked a campsite at a well-known campground deep in the woods. It wasn't exactly off the grid, but it was far enough from the conveniences of modern life to feel like an adventure. The first couple of days were perfect. We hiked trails that offered breathtaking views, cooled off in swimming holes, and explored hidden spots in the woods. Each night, we gathered around the campfire, roasted marshmallows, and told stories. The weather was warm, and the days were long. On the second day, we tackled one of the more challenging trails. It was a steep, rocky climb that rewarded us with a panoramic view of the valley below. By the time we made it back to the campground that evening, we were all exhausted. After a quick dinner, I took care of cleaning up while Emily got the kids ready for bed. I packed up the food and cookware and stashed everything in the car to avoid attracting animals. It was then that I noticed something moving in the shadows near the edge of the campsite. At first, I thought it was another camper or maybe a large dog, but when it stepped into the light, I froze. A black bear, massive and muscular, stood just a few feet away, sniffing the air. Its eyes locked onto me, and for a moment, neither of us moved. I had read about bears in the area, but seeing one up close was a completely different experience. My heart pounded as I gripped the pot and spoon I'd been using to clean up. The bear took a step closer, its snout twitching. It wasn't aggressive yet, but it was way too close for comfort. Without thinking, I raised the spoon and banged it against the pot as hard as I could. The sound echoed through the quiet campground, loud enough to make my ears ring. The bear flinched, backed up a step, then turned and lumbered into the woods. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Not 5 minutes later, the bear came back. This time, it was even closer, almost brushing up against the picnic table. I could have reached out and touched its nose if I wanted to. My stomach twisted in knots as I repeated the same tactic, banging the pot right in its face. I yelled as loud as I could, waving the pot like a lunatic, and this time I followed the bear as it retreated. I didn't stop making noise until I was sure it was far enough away. That night, I hardly slept. Every sound outside the tent made my heart race. The bear didn't return, but the thought of it lurking nearby kept me on edge. By morning, the encounter had turned into a sort of family legend. The kids joked about Dad fighting a bear, and I played along, but deep down, I couldn't shake the fear. The days went on, and we continued exploring the area, trying to put the bear incident behind us. On the last night of the trip, July 4th, we drove into a nearby town to watch the fireworks. It had been a hot, sunny day, and the fireworks show was the perfect way to wrap up the week. By the time we got back to the campground, it was late, and the kids were half asleep in the back seat. Around midnight, a storm rolled in. At first, it was just light rain, but it quickly escalated. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and thunder rumbled so loudly that it felt like the ground was shaking. I noticed rain seeping into the tent, and I knew we needed to act fast to keep everything dry. Jake, always eager to help, came out with me to put a tarp over the tent. The wind was so strong that it nearly ripped the tarp out of my hands. Tree branches snapped and fell around us, some landing dangerously close. Tall trees swayed and bent under the force of the storm, and I couldn't help but imagine one of them toppling over onto us. The campground was chaos. I saw people abandoning their tents, running to their cars, and driving away. Their tents were left to the mercy of the wind, some of them rolling away like tumbleweeds. But leaving wasn't an option for us. We were too far from home, and the thought of leaving all our gear behind was unbearable. We hunkered down in the tent, trying to ride out the storm. The kids were terrified, and I felt completely helpless. I couldn't protect them from the storm or the falling branches. Every creak and groan of the trees above us made my stomach churn. The hours dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. By morning, the storm had passed, but the campground was unrecognizable. Debris was everywhere. Fallen branches, pieces of tents, and even a few downed telephone poles. Our tent had somehow survived, but it was soaked and covered in leaves and mud. I felt like a zombie, having barely slept all night. We packed up as quickly as we could and started the long drive home. The kids were quiet, and even Emily, who usually found a way to stay positive, looked shaken. About 5 hours into the drive, we stopped at a farm in Vermont to stretch our legs. While the others explored the farm store, I leaned back in the car and closed my eyes, finally letting myself relax for the first time in what felt like days. Looking back, that trip was one of the most intense experiences of my life. The bear encounter was terrifying, but the storm was something else entirely. It reminded me of how small and vulnerable we are in the face of nature's power. Even now, when I think about those nights, I get a knot in my stomach. It's a memory that will stay with me forever. A mix of fear, awe, and gratitude that we made it through. It was the middle of the week, a Wednesday to be exact, and my buddy Kyle and I decided to get away from everything. We were both in our late 20s, and life had gotten busy for us both. I worked in construction, and Kyle had his hands full with school and his side business. We hadn't hung out much over the past few months, so we figured a camping trip in the Idaho backcountry would be a perfect way to reconnect. It was one of those places in the mountains where people didn't really go unless they had a reason. The nearest town was small, barely 600 people, and about an hour's drive away. It felt like the kind of place where you could just disappear if you wanted to. We set out in my old truck, loaded with gear, on a long, dusty road that twisted and turned through forests and narrow valleys. By the time we reached our spot, the sun was starting to dip behind the peaks. I'd been here a few times before, but Kyle had never experienced these deep woods. We had no cell service, and that was just how we liked it. After getting the truck parked, we made quick work of setting up camp. We threw up the tents and gathered firewood. The air was crisp, the kind of cool that only comes with mountain evenings. By 7 p.m., we had a decent fire going. The scent of wood smoke filled the air, mixing with the earthy smell of pine trees. We cracked open some cans of beer, threw a few hot dogs on the grill, and sat back to enjoy the quiet. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of wind through the trees. It felt good to be out here, far from the noise and chaos of everyday life. We didn't have any plans for tomorrow, just going to relax, maybe do some shooting in the morning, and enjoy the wilderness. As it got darker, we started snacking on chips and shooting the breeze. It was peaceful. For a moment, I didn't want anything more than this. But then, about an hour into the night, we heard something. At first, it was so quiet that I thought it was the wind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again. There were branches cracking, followed by the unmistakable sound of bushes being disturbed, like something was moving up the mountain, slowly, deliberately. We both fell silent, listening intently. The fire flickered, casting long shadows on the trees around us. The sounds came from the direction of the hillside, off to our left, down the valley. It was too dark to see anything up there, but I knew this part of the mountain well. The trees were thick and the terrain was steep. There shouldn't have been anyone out here, let alone anything that would make that kind of noise. As soon as we stopped talking, the noises stopped. It was like the forest itself held its breath. I glanced over at Kyle, and he met my eyes. Neither of us said anything, but we both knew something was up. We sat there in the quiet for a few minutes, trying to shake the feeling that someone or something was watching us. But as the silence stretched on, we tried to shrug it off. We had guns with us. We were in the middle of nowhere, and the nearest town was miles away. What could be out here? I tossed another log on the fire, and we resumed talking, trying to act normal. But then, just like before, the rustling came back, a little closer this time. The sound of something moving down the hill, carefully, purposefully. We went silent again, and once more, the noise stopped. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I glanced at Kyle, who looked just as uneasy as I felt. We weren't stupid. We had brought rifles for a reason. Tomorrow was supposed to be a day at the range, just two guys blowing off some steam. But now, out here in the dark, it felt like we needed them sooner than we'd planned. This wasn't right. I knew the area well enough to know that the wildlife didn't act this way. Whatever it was seemed to know when we were quiet, and it would stop moving. We didn't say anything for a while, just sat there, each of us trying to make sense of the situation. But then it happened again, more movement, closer this time. Something was definitely coming down the slope, and it was moving fast. Too fast for an animal. It was as if it was following the same pattern, waiting for us to stop talking and then moving again when we resumed. I grabbed my rifle from the truck and checked it, making sure it was loaded. We both had our guns at the ready now. The fire was still burning brightly, but the shadows were growing deeper around us. The rustling continued, and this time it was much closer. Maybe 200 feet away, just beyond the reach of the firelight. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I didn't want to show it. Kyle was standing now, his hand gripping the stock of his rifle, his face pale. Whatever this was, it wasn't normal. I could tell it wasn't just some bear or deer. The movements were too deliberate, and the way it would stop and start, almost as if it was watching us, made it feel wrong. I couldn't take it anymore. I took the rifle, aimed it into the air, and fired a shot. The loud crack of the rifle echoed across the valley, shattering the silence. The fire crackled, and the woods fell still. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, out of nowhere, whatever it was moved. It didn't just move, it bolted. The sound of it scrambling up the mountainside was like nothing I had ever heard. It was fast, way too fast for an animal, and there was no sound of it crashing through the trees or anything. Just a quick, fluid movement that made the hair on my neck stand up straight. In less than 30 seconds, it had covered at least 400 feet, disappearing into the darkness. The sound of its retreating footsteps was like a distant thunder, gradually fading into the night. It moved with an unnatural speed, and the terrain was rough. There was no way something could move that fast through the thick underbrush in complete darkness. Kyle and I stood there for what felt like hours, staring into the blackness, waiting for any sign that it might come back. But there was nothing. It was quiet, too quiet. We didn't speak and we didn't move. Our fire, which had been roaring, now seemed small and insignificant in the vast expanse of wilderness. We stayed up for a while longer, sitting on edge, not knowing what to think. I kept my rifle close, even though I wasn't sure what we were supposed to do with it. There was no explanation for what had just happened. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person. It was something else, something I couldn't put into words. But whatever it was, it knew we were there, and it knew when to stop and when to move. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we decided to pack up. We didn't talk much. Kyle loaded the gear into the truck, and I kept my eyes on the forest, half expecting whatever it was to appear out of the darkness again. But it didn't. We left that night, driving back in silence. We didn't speak about it then, and we haven't really talked about it much since. But I can't shake the feeling that whatever we heard and saw that night was something that wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't just a bear or a mountain lion. It was too smart, too fast, and too aware of us. We haven't gone back to those woods since that night, and we don't plan to. It's been a few years now, but I still remember that sound, the way it moved, and the way it made us feel like we were just prey in a game we didn't understand. I still don't know what it was, and part of me doesn't ever want to know. Some things are better left unexplained, because once you figure it out, it's already too late. We haven't talked about it much since that night, but I'm not sure I'll ever forget it. Every time I see those mountains in the distance, I get a chill, like I can still hear the rustling in the dark. I don't know what it was, but I know I don't want to find out. It was meant to be a simple trip, a break from the grind, a time to bond with the kids and get them into nature. After all, we had camped before, albeit in the less rugged, more controlled spots. But this time was different. I decided to push for something more authentic, deep in the woods, away from the distractions of modern life, near a small forested area called Big Meadows. It's beautiful there. Dense woods, the kind where the sunlight barely touches the forest floor, and the air is thick with the scent of pine. My kids, Jake and Eli, were excited. It was their first time really camping, and even at ages 7 and 12, they were eager to help set up the tent and make s'mores by the fire. I didn't expect the animal activity to rattle them so much on the first night. The noises were constant. Hooting owls, distant howls, rustling in the bushes. At least that's what I thought they were at the time. In the dark, surrounded by towering trees, it felt like we were being watched, listened to. The night dragged on. I could feel Jake's small hand gripping mine tighter as the shadows played tricks on his young mind. Eli, too, kept peeking out of the tent, his face pale, his body tense. It was the scurrying of larger animals that really got to them. At one point, I heard something heavy moving outside. Not a deer. This was something bigger, closer, and definitely more curious. The low growl from the woods made me freeze. I could hear Jake's breath quicken beside me, and then Eli whispered, "What if it's a bear?" I brushed it off at first, trying to reassure them that bears wouldn't come near a camp with a fire. But the sound of something larger still moving close by had me second-guessing myself. We barely slept that night. It was torture. I spent most of the time awake, listening to the forest, half expecting something to brush past the tent at any moment. By morning, Jake's face was streaked with tears. Eli had his arms wrapped tightly around his little brother, both of them too scared to even look out of the tent. I didn't want to risk it, so I made the decision. We packed up and moved to one of the small cabins nearby. It was safer, more secure. The thought of sleeping inside a wooden cabin felt more comforting than being in that thin-walled tent. The second morning started off cold and damp. I tried to shake the unease from the night before as I unpacked our things into the cabin, but a part of me still felt like something wasn't right. The kids were quieter than usual. Even Eli, usually so full of energy, didn't say much. They were still shaken by the sounds from last night, but I figured they'd get used to it by the end of the trip. When I woke up that morning, the cabin was eerily still. I expected to hear Jake or Eli whispering, or at least the sound of them moving around in their sleeping bags. But the silence felt off. I looked over to the corner where they'd been sleeping. Nothing. At first, I assumed they'd gone outside to explore, but then I saw the door cracked open. I stood up fast, my heart sinking in my chest. My first thought was that they'd wandered off into the woods, not knowing how dangerous it could be. It didn't take long to find them, though. They were standing at the base of a tall oak tree not far from the cabin, their heads tilted upward. They were pointing. I felt my blood run cold when I realized they weren't looking at squirrels or birds, but something much bigger. At first, I didn't believe my eyes. 2 small black bear cubs were perched high in the tree, watching the world below, completely unaware of the danger they were in. The kids were fascinated by them, mesmerized, but my stomach twisted in a way I can't describe. In that moment, I knew everything could go wrong. I'd heard of bear encounters in this area before, but I never thought I'd be the one in the middle of it. The cubs were small, maybe a few months old, but there was no mistaking what was out there. And that meant one thing: Mama Bear couldn't be far behind. I tried to keep my movements slow, controlled, as I approached the boys, trying not to startle them. But the terror? It was choking me. What if Mama Bear decided to charge? What if she thought we were a threat to her cubs? Jake and Eli were frozen, staring up at the cubs, completely oblivious to the danger. I reached them quietly, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced with every worst-case scenario. What if Mama Bear was already watching us from the shadows? What if she'd charge before I could get them out of there? I didn't say anything. I just grabbed their hands and started pulling them back toward the cabin, slowly at first, trying to avoid making any sudden movements that might trigger a reaction from the cubs, or worse, their mother. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but it felt like I was holding my breath the entire time. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see a massive bear rushing toward us. My legs were shaking, and I was sure I wasn't going to make it out without something horrible happening. It's hard to explain that feeling of waiting for something terrible to happen but not being able to control it. I kept my eyes on the tree, where the cubs stayed motionless, and wondered if they'd heard us. My thoughts raced. What if the adults who'd been out here earlier with their cameras had already given the bears a sense of security around people? That's when the true horror hit me. Other families were walking around, some with their kids, some carrying cameras. They had seen the cubs, and rather than leaving them be, they were snapping pictures, pointing them out to their own children. It was as if they couldn't fathom what danger we were in. People who had never been in the wild didn't understand. If a mother bear thought her cubs were in danger, she would fight. And people could never understand the danger they were putting themselves and their children in by treating the cubs like a zoo attraction. I had never been so scared in my life. I tried to keep my kids calm, my voice steady, but inside I was panicking. I wanted to get back to the cabin, lock the door, and never come out again until it was safe. Finally, the rangers arrived. They had been called by someone who had seen us at the tree. They explained to the crowd, especially the families, why it was so dangerous to be near bears. They gave a stern warning, making sure the people understood that this wasn't just about the animals. This was a matter of life and death for everyone involved. A few of the families looked embarrassed, but there was one couple who didn't seem to get it. They had even brought their kids to the tree to see the bears, all while the cubs stayed hidden in the branches above. Later, when we were alone, I found myself reflecting on what the ranger had said. It wasn't just about the bears. It was about people. People were often the worst part of nature. I remember one particularly chilling thing the ranger mentioned, an incident that made my stomach churn. He told us about some men who had lured a deer into their camp by feeding it by hand until they could get close enough to beat it to death with a bat. It wasn't just a sickening act. It was a reminder of the kind of people we might encounter in the wild. People who didn't care about the balance of nature, who saw animals as nothing more than targets. That moment stuck with me. The park ranger explained that it wasn't just the bears or the other wildlife that we needed to fear. It was the people who didn't respect nature. They were far more dangerous. By the time we were packing up to leave, I had learned a hard lesson. It wasn't just about keeping the kids safe from wild animals. It was about teaching them how to respect nature the way it is meant to be respected. And more than anything, it was about recognizing that sometimes people could be just as dangerous as any wild animal. The rest of our trip was uneventful, but the lesson stuck with Jake and Eli. We talk about it every time we go camping. I hope they understand it, what real danger looks like and how to respect the wild. But most of all, I hope they understand that it's not the animals we have to fear the most. It's the people who think they can tame them. In the years since, the trip to Big Meadows has become a story we share with others, not as a tale of terror, but as a reminder to respect the wilderness and the creatures that inhabit it. And to never forget that sometimes the people you meet out there are the real danger. I've always liked the idea of camping in strange places. So when I found out about a small village with a graveyard hidden away in a valley, I thought it would be the perfect spot for a solo trip. The graveyard wasn't big, just a few old, worn gravestones surrounded by a wooden fence. The village itself was quiet, almost too quiet, with only a few houses scattered here and there. I set up my tent just outside the graveyard, next to a patch of tall grass, and got comfortable for the night. The sun went down behind the trees, and the air turned cooler. I didn't mind being alone. It was peaceful in a strange way. But as the night grew darker, something didn't feel right. I heard a faint rustling sound, almost like footsteps, coming from the other side of the fence. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind, but it didn't feel like the wind. The sound kept going, steady, like someone was walking back and forth. My heart started to race, but I told myself to stay calm. The wind picked up a little, and the rustling got louder. Then, I heard a scraping sound, like something heavy was being dragged along the ground. I froze, holding my breath, hoping whatever it was would just go away. Then I heard it, the creak of the gate, like it was opening. My stomach sank. The village was too far for anyone to be walking around here, and I had checked the gate earlier. It was closed. I didn't want to peek outside the tent, but I could hear soft steps getting closer. Was it an animal? Person? I couldn't stand the waiting any longer. I grabbed my flashlight, crawled out of the tent, and pointed the light across the graveyard. Nothing. There was no one. The gate was still shut. But the scraping sound kept going, now from the other side of the graveyard. My heart beat faster, and I took a step forward, trying to calm myself. As I walked toward the far corner of the graveyard, the scraping stopped suddenly. The air felt heavy, like it was hard to breathe. I looked around, trying to figure out where the sound had come from. That's when I saw it. One of the old gravestones had been moved, and there was a shallow hole underneath. It wasn't very deep, but it was big enough to hide something. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart thudded in my chest. I took a slow step back, my neck prickling. Then, I heard the scrape again, louder this time, like something was climbing out of the hole. My body froze, my legs refusing to move. I felt trapped, staring at the dark, empty space. I couldn't take it anymore. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The night went completely quiet, and all I could hear was my own breath. I didn't dare go near the hole. I didn't even want to look at it anymore. I quickly packed up my things, not caring if I was rushing. I just wanted to get out of there. Couldn't sleep that night. I stayed at the village inn, my mind replaying every sound I'd heard, every movement. When I went back to the graveyard the next morning, everything looked normal. The graveyard was just as it had been before, empty, silent, and untouched. But I knew what I had heard. I knew what I had felt. Something had been down there, waiting. And as I was leaving the village, I overheard the old man running the inn talking to a woman. He didn't see me, so I only caught bits and pieces, but one thing stood out. The woman was asking about the graveyard, and he said something about how it wasn't unusual for people to disappear around there. I didn't ask any more questions. All I knew was that when I left, I felt eyes watching me from behind every tree, every shadow. I don't know what was buried under that gravestone, but I do know this. It wasn't empty, and whatever was waiting down there wasn't finished yet. I've never gone back to that village. I don't think I ever will. I was camping with a couple of friends just outside a small, quiet town near the border. The area was known for its rough, hilly land and thick woods. It felt pretty isolated, but that's exactly what we wanted. Something away from the usual camping spots. We set up our tents near an old trail that didn't seem to be used much. We later found out that the trail had a bad reputation, but at the time we didn't know any of that. The weather was good, with a pale blue sky and a few clouds drifting lazily across. We built a campfire, opened some beers, and settled in for a peaceful evening. But the longer we stayed, the more I started to feel that something was off. The forest around us was way too quiet. There were no birds chirping, no animals moving around. Just the occasional rustle of leaves in the trees that could have been the wind, or maybe something else. Something bigger. As the sun began to set, I noticed how quickly it was getting dark. The sky turned a deep blue, and the shadows of the trees grew long and creepy. That's when I heard it. Faint at first, like footsteps in the distance, but way too heavy to be a deer or any other animal. My friends didn't seem to hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I decided to take a walk around the camp, hoping it would clear my head. The forest was thick, and the trail wasn't easy to follow in the dimming light. As I moved deeper into the woods, I heard the same sound again, the footsteps, but now they were closer. It wasn't just in my head. I could hear them clearly. I stopped and listened, and the noise stopped too. I convinced myself it was nothing, just my nerves getting the best of me. But that feeling in my gut kept telling me to turn back. I didn't listen. I kept walking, trying to tell myself it was just the wind. Then I found a small clearing in the trees. The ground was torn up like something big had been dragged through it. The air felt too still, like the forest was holding its breath. I crouched down to take a closer look at the disturbed earth. It wasn't right. My heart started pounding in my chest. I knew I needed to get back to camp. But just as I turned to leave, I saw it. A movement out of the corner of my eye. Something big moving between the trees. I froze. I couldn't make out what it was, but it was huge. Way too big for any animal I'd ever seen. I couldn't even tell if it was a person or something else. It didn't feel right. The footsteps I had heard before started again, this time fast and heavy, coming straight toward me. My body froze with fear. I could feel the cold sweat on my neck. I ran back to camp as fast as I could, my heart hammering in my chest. When I got there, my friends were still sitting by the fire, laughing, completely unaware of what had just happened. I didn't tell them about what I saw. I just told them to pack up and leave, no questions asked. I didn't care if I sounded crazy or paranoid. There was something out there, something wrong, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what. We packed everything up and left that night. The drive down the rough road felt like it took forever, but the farther we got from that place, the more the tightness in my chest loosened. It wasn't until we got to town that I finally felt like I could breathe again. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of that thing I'd seen moving between the trees. I couldn't forget the way the air felt, how still everything was. I didn't want to think about it, but it kept creeping into my mind. Something was wrong with that place. The forest wasn't just dangerous, it was something else. I don't know what it was, but I'm sure of one thing. People don't go out there anymore. Not unless they want to disappear. I won't ever go back. And I don't think anyone else should either. If you ever hear about that spot, about the border and the old trail, stay away. Whatever was out there, it's not just a wild animal. I don't know what it was, but I know one thing for sure. It was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. And I don't think it's ever stopped. We had been excited about the camping trip for weeks. My husband and I had booked a small spot deep in the woods, far away from the noise and distractions of the city. It was late summer and the days were still warm, but the nights were getting cooler. We set up our tent and gathered some wood to start a fire. Everything felt perfect. The air was calm, and the silence was unlike anything we get at home. That evening, we sat by the fire, and everything seemed peaceful. At first, I didn't think much of the sounds coming from the trees. It was probably just the wind or maybe an animal moving through the brush. But then the sounds started to get closer. It didn't sound like wind or any animal I knew. It sounded like footsteps, slow, heavy, and steady. My husband didn't notice it at first. He was focused on the fire, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that my mind was playing tricks on me in the quiet of the woods. But as the night went on, the sounds grew louder. I stood up and looked around, but the woods were empty. The trees around our campsite looked like shadows in the dark, and the light from the fire didn't reach far enough to show anything beyond that. I felt my heart beat faster when I saw something. Movement at the edge of the clearing, just outside the light of the fire. I froze, staring into the dark, my eyes trying to see anything. For a second, everything was still. But then the movement happened again, this time much closer. It was almost at the edge of the tent. My chest tightened, and I quickly motioned for my husband to stop. We both sat still, not moving, listening hard. The footsteps were real, and they were getting closer. Too close. I felt a chill run through me. There was no one else out here, no other campers or hikers. We were miles away from the nearest person. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, like something or someone was out there, hiding just out of sight. After a moment, my husband finally heard it too. His face went pale, and he started looking around, trying to spot whatever was out there. I don't know what I expected, a person, maybe an animal, but what I didn't expect was the noise. It was a rough, scraping sound coming from the trees, followed by a low, deep growl. I felt my body freeze, my mind screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. We sat there in the dark, the fire crackling, the growl fading into the distance. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. The whole forest felt dead quiet, like it was holding its breath. I kept thinking whatever it was would appear from the shadows, but it never did. We didn't sleep much that night. My husband stayed awake, keeping watch, while I lay in the tent, staring at the walls, listening for any sound. Every creak of the tent or crack of a twig felt like it might be something coming closer. When morning came, we packed up quickly, not saying much to each other. The woods felt wrong, empty in a way that I couldn't explain. The air was thick, like something was hiding just beyond the trees, watching us. By the time we made it to the car, I had this horrible feeling that something was still following us. My heart was racing, and I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something moving in the trees. We didn't talk about it on the way home, but we didn't need to. We both knew something had been out there with us. I haven't gone camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. I still don't know what happened that night, but I've learned that some places should be left alone. And some feelings, like the one that never really left me, are better ignored. I don't care what it was, but I know one thing for sure: we weren't alone out there. And as much as I wish I could forget that night, I know the woods won't ever let me, because some things stay with you long after you leave. I decided to go camping alone. I had been struggling with depression for a long time, and I thought maybe the quiet of the woods would help clear my head. I found a spot by a small lake, far enough from the nearest trail to feel alone, but close enough to my car if I needed it. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. The silence felt strange, like it was pressing in on me. I spent hours staring at the fire, feeling numb. The woods around me were still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't exactly fear, but more like I wasn't completely alone. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that it was just my mind making things up. But it didn't feel that way. The next day, I decided to go for a walk to get my mind off things. I needed to keep moving or else I'd get stuck thinking about everything. I followed a narrow path that cut through thick trees. The air was cool, and the only sound was the crunch of dry leaves under my boots. After a while, I came to a small clearing. It seemed like a good place to stop and breathe, so I sat on a fallen log. But as soon as I sat down, the feeling of unease came back. It was like the woods were closing in on me, like I couldn't escape the silence. I tried to push it aside and decided to keep walking, but something stopped me. There, just at the edge of the clearing, were fresh footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. I froze. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. The prints were big, deep, like someone heavy had been walking through here, and they led deeper into the woods. I felt my heart race and my thoughts spun. Someone had been out here. Someone had been watching me. I didn't waste any more time. I turned around and headed back to camp, but with every step, the feeling that I was being followed grew stronger. It wasn't just in my head anymore. I could hear its soft, faint sounds of twigs snapping behind me, quicken my pace, my heart pounding. The woods felt too quiet, too still. The only sound now was my own footsteps and the faint crunching behind me. When I finally reached camp, I was out of breath and relieved. But then I saw it. The fire pit wasn't the same. The logs I'd carefully stacked were knocked over, scattered around. And my sleeping bag, which I had left neatly folded, was now open and unfolded on the ground. My stomach dropped. I had been away for hours, but no one else had come by. No one was supposed to be here. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to jump in my car and leave right away. But there was another part of me that felt like I couldn't just run. Like if I left now, something would be worse than if I stayed. So I stayed. I decided to keep my eyes open through the night and leave first thing in the morning. But the night dragged on. Couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, branches cracking, leaves rustling. Every time I opened my eyes, it felt like someone was closer, just out of sight. My heart raced in the dark, but I couldn't see anyone. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but the sounds never stopped. I stayed awake the whole night, feeling like I was being hunted. And then, when the sun started to rise, I finally let myself relax. I was exhausted, but I forced myself to pack up and get out. I just wanted to leave the woods behind. As I drove down the narrow road, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, sure that someone would be following me. But when I glanced back, the road was empty. The woods were silent. When I finally got home, I tried to shake off what had happened, but the feeling stayed with me. It wasn't until later, when I was alone in my room, that it hit me. The truth. No one had been following me. There hadn't been anyone out there. It was my own mind, dragging me deeper into my depression. It was my own fears turning the world around me into something to be afraid of. The footsteps, the sounds in the woods, the feeling of being watched. They were all me. I had been running from myself the whole time. The worst part, the thing I didn't realize until it was too late, was that the woods hadn't just mirrored my depression. They'd made it worse. And now, even at home, I felt like I wasn't truly alone. The shadows in my room felt a little too dark, the silence a little too loud. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had brought something back with me, something that wasn't just in my mind, something that wasn't going to leave.